Jim Henson didn't do too many interviews, especially not for The Dark Crystal. He was back and forth creating many projects during this time of The Dark Crystal recording, so I think he just preferred to imagine and create rather than interview. When watching a Jim Henson documentary, of which there are many, I ran across a Dark Crystal interview that I had yet to see, and that is exactly what we'll be watching together today on The Dark Crystal Conjunction.
Stumbled upon a great world to learn and know, passing time that came with...
Howdy y'all, and welcome to the Dark Crystal Conjunction, your YouTube space to nerd out about all things the Dark Crystal. Let's talk about this interview real quick. It is a small clip from a larger interview that came out on a show called Time and Again, which was a retrospective television series that aired on NBC from 1996 to 2000. It was hosted by Jane Pauley, and the program focuses on iconic events and people using footage from the NBC News archives. One episode profiles the career of Jim Henson, highlighting clips of the Muppets' many appearances on the Today Show, including their earliest appearance from 1961, as well as the making of The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth. The show features archive interviews with Henson, Frank Oz, Jane Henson, and Brian Henson, and much, much more. It is an hour-long show, but today I just wanted to highlight the section that contains the Dark Crystal. The same section also features the Labyrinth, but I left that in because at the end it talks about the legacy that these movies left behind, specifically talking about Jim Henson's creature shops. So without any further ado, let's pop this VHS tape into our VCRs and watch.
Out by the Skeksis' evil sight, forever tied to their couch.
When we come back, some very different kinds of characters in the movies.
Ah, now that's more like it.
And Jim Henson is remembered by those who knew him best when Time and Again continues.
Well, I think he found life very, very rich. And every time, if something got him down, he'd turn a corner and something was wonderful.
Welcome back to Time and Again as we spend some time with Jim Henson and the Muppets. From the beginning, the Muppets were made for television. Local TV in the mid-50s, The Today Show in the early 60s, Sesame Street beginning in 1969, the original Saturday Night Live in the mid-70s, and a show of their own, The Muppet Show, starting in 1976. But there have also been movies, including The Muppet Movie, The Great Muppet Caper, and The Muppets Take Manhattan.
What's going on?
You're going on. It's Broadway. You made it.
Yeah, that's right.
Jim Henson liked to entertain kids with his characters, but his creative vision did not end there. In 1982, with the release of an elaborate fantasy called The Dark Crystal, NBC's Jim Brown had a look at the Muppet phenomenon.
First, there were puppets. Then, there were Muppets. Then came a philosopher called Yoda.
Great warrior.
And last summer, an extraterrestrial named E.T. Now there's a movie that combines all the advances made in creature technology called The Dark Crystal, in which manipulated characters completely take the place of human actors.
Master, what's wrong?
You are in danger, Guildling.
The Dark Crystal is a fantasy about good and evil, trials and tribulations, curses and witches, complete with a bright-voiced hero and a long-haired heroine. The Dark Crystal belongs to Muppet creator Jim Henson and his co-director Frank Oz.
What is exciting about this whole process is that I think we've come to the point where you can do almost anything in a film that you dream up, no matter what kind of imagery. And I think that's borne out in the other films recently, in the last couple of years. And I think that's very exciting. I think films now, it's expensive, because this was an expensive film, but basically I think we've reached the point where you can do almost anything that you can conceive of.
Henson says what separates The Dark Crystal from what has come before is the level of realism.
The Muppets are basically what I think of as puppetry, where it's half a caricature, it's almost a cartoon, it's a stylized form of life. And with this film, what we tried to create were characters that actually lived and breathed. So we're trying to really create something that people will believe is alive.
The Skeksis killed my mother and father.
The story runs deeper than you know.
This is a mystic, and we had about 3 or 4 major types of characters, and there are 9 of these mystics in the film. And basically, he's operated, when he's moving, he's operated by a single person inside. And it's a very difficult position because when you actually walk down on your haunches. And we had a team of performers that worked about 6 or 8 months before we started shooting, working out every day, deciding how each of these guys moves and that sort of thing. But basically, you're operating with the weight of the hand on your right hand. The left hand is in here, and then there are cable controls that do things like eye movement. This guy here is Jen, and he's sort of a major character that goes through the film, and I was operating him. And so most of the time with him, one is operating up through the center of the body, more like a regular puppet in terms of manipulation. But we'd have a team of people doing the eyes, which were on radio control. The complicated thing about performing these guys as opposed to performing things like the Muppets, these things looked very alive, and that was our whole intent, was to make them look like a living thing. And so the subtlety of the performance is what was complicated.
Kira, you don't have to go.
I know.
We were trying to solve the problem of how to manipulate a particular kind of thing that our gelflings had to get on and ride very fast. And one day, one of our performers, who was a clown, came in with his 10-foot stilts. And he was walking around the rehearsal room, and all of a sudden it dawned on us that this could be a basis of a creature. These are our pod people, sort of podlings. They're the peasants that sort of live out in the forest, and they're very simple people. This is the closest thing to sort of normal puppetry in the whole film, because most of these are operated just about like regular hand puppets. The whole set was done operating up through the floor. To me, this film was a marvelous challenge, and so we went into it not really knowing if we could pull it off, but it's kind of the most exciting challenge that we've tackled so far.
Jim Henson in 1982. 4 years later, building on what he'd learned making the Dark Crystal, Henson and his creative team came up with Labyrinth, with Star Wars creator George Lucas as executive producer. The creatures in Labyrinth were a far cry from your everyday Muppets.
Now, would you go left or right?
Hi there, and welcome to one of the sets of our new movie, Labyrinth. And like everything else around here, things are not always what they seem.
See? There's nothing to be afraid of.
Well, to me, the film is really about growing up. It's really about the maturing process. When we were casting it, I didn't realize that we had a lot of scenes that were going to be, they're potentially difficult or uncomfortable or look dangerous. I don't think any of them were dangerous, but we had areas where, and the Shaft of Hands was one, where Jenny was way up at the top of the studio. She's sort of suspended in the air with nothing beneath her, and she's, 40 feet in the air. This is a scary situation to a lot of people.
In 3, 2, 1, drop.
22, 21, 20, 19, 18, 17, 16.
And cut. That's a good one.
Labyrinth showcased the work of Jim Henson's Creature Shop, which evolved into a business in its own right, providing creative and technical expertise to other filmmakers. It produced characters for Babe and Dr. Dolittle, even prosthetics for the film The English Patient. When we come back, the Muppets return to television on the Jim Henson Hour, including a guest appearance by yours truly in a moment.
Good morning, America.
What's your language?